Tucson, Arizona. For 10 years, Tucson was Arizona's capital, a sun-baked outpost where desert winds swept through adobe corridors. The climate was harsh, but it was a center of trade and culture. When the seat moved north, Tucson didn't fade. It grew into a modern city that still remembers when lawmakers rode in on horseback to argue under a blazing desert sky. Newport, Rhode Island. Once the pride of the Atlantic trade, Newport was half of Rhode Island's two-headed capital system for nearly 2 centuries. Its harbor brimmed with ships, and its streets with governors and merchants. But as Providence grew, politics shifted north. The state finally consolidated power in 1900. Newport kept its mansions, its sea breezes, and the memories of when every major decision passed through town. New Bern, North Carolina. Long before Raleigh, the colony's business was done in New Bern, a graceful town on 2 rivers, rich with Georgian homes and quiet wealth. Hurricanes and politics convinced leaders to build something new in the center of the state. Raleigh rose and New Bern slipped into history. Yet its old Capitol building still stands, holding the soft echo of the debates that once built a state. Lewiston, Idaho. In 1863, when Idaho Territory was carved from the frontier, Lewiston became its first capital, crowded, muddy, and alive with miners from every direction. But Boise, far to the south, wanted the job. The move sparked lawsuits and shouting matches, but by 1865, the decision stuck. Lewiston returned to river trade, proud of its title as Idaho's first capital, even if only for a heartbeat. Vincennes, Indiana. In the early 1800s, Vincennes was the edge of the American frontier. Canoes on the Wabash, flags of 3 nations, and the first territorial governor's mansion. It was Indiana's heart until settlers pushed east and north, chasing farmland and safety from raids. When the capital moved, Vincennes stayed a pleasant river town, but the seat of power slipped away, like the river mist each morning. Lancaster, Pennsylvania. When the Revolution ended, Lancaster had its turn as state capital. For a dozen years, lawmakers gathered beneath its church spires and tavern roofs. But central geography won again, and the government moved to Harrisburg in 1812. Lancaster went back to being a merchant town, bustling, independent, and a little proud that for a while it ruled one of America's earliest states. Corydon, Indiana. Corydon was small but proud, the meeting place where Indiana became a state. Its limestone capital and shady town square saw a young democracy learning to walk. But the frontier kept moving, and by 1825, Indianapolis was the new crossroads. The politicians left, but the old State House still stands, a relic of when a frontier town was briefly the center of a brand new state, Prescott, Arizona. High in the pine country, Prescott served twice as territorial capital. Lawmakers met in log halls surrounded by miners and soldiers. But politics kept bouncing, first to Tucson, then back again. In 1889, Phoenix took the prize for good. Prescott stayed charming, a mountain town with wooden sidewalks and old saloons, quietly proud of the time when Arizona's laws were born on its streets. Bannack, Montana. Bannack's gold rush in 1862 brought fortune seekers and lawmen alike, and soon it became the territorial capital. Wooden buildings lined the creek, and the hills glittered with promise. But as the strikes played out, the crowds moved on to Virginia City, taking the title with them. Bannack stayed behind, quiet, eerie, and perfectly preserved, a ghost of the first capital in Big Sky country, Cahaba, Alabama. Built between 2 rivers, Cahaba looked like a dream. Brick courthouses, cotton docks, and steamboats stacked with bales. But the land was low and the waters high. Every flood took another piece of it until the politicians packed up for drier ground. By the late 1800s, the old capital was a ghost. Its streets washed smooth, its name mostly whispered by historians and fishermen. Tuscaloosa, Alabama. For 20 good years, Tuscaloosa stood proud as Alabama's capital, a college town alive with debate and building. But by the 1840s, folks called it too far west, and the State House moved again, chasing geography and growth. The university stayed, the politics didn't. When the legislature left for Montgomery, Tuscaloosa went quiet, its grand brick buildings left behind like echoes of ambition. Houston, Texas. When Houston became capital of the Republic of Texas, it was little more than muddy streets and ambition. Sam Houston himself pushed for it, and for 2 years it bustled with diplomats and soldiers. But the swamps, mosquitoes, and flooding made the job miserable. In 1839, the government packed up for Austin. Houston didn't mind. It found new fame in oil and opportunity instead. Vandalia, Illinois. Built to replace flood-prone Kaskaskia, Vandalia was a new start. Fresh streets, proud courthouse, and a steady stream of legislators. For nearly 20 years, it worked. Then the talk turned north. A young lawyer named Abraham Lincoln backed moving the seat to Springfield, and the vote carried. When the wagons left, Vandalia's capital dreams left with them, leaving behind a fine brick capital and a wistful legend. St. Louis, Missouri. Long before the arch and the city bustle, St. Louis held the title of territorial capital, a rough-edge crossroads where French traders and frontier Americans shared streets. When Missouri gained statehood, politics drifted inland to be closer to the people. The city never looked back. It traded legislative halls for riverboats, factories, and fame, while the new capital settled quietly up the Missouri River. Milledgeville, Georgia. Milledgeville rose from the red clay to be Georgia's proud capital for 60 years, a model town of columns, courthouses, and grand debate. But the Civil War shattered everything. Sherman's troops marched through. The government fled, and after Reconstruction, the capital moved to booming Atlanta. Today, Milledgeville still stands, slower, smaller, but you can feel the echoes of Governor's footsteps on its old brick streets. Jamestown, Virginia. The first permanent English capital in America began as a few wooden huts and a dream. Fire, famine, and mosquitoes tested it again and again. In 1699, after yet another fire and too many graves, leaders finally moved inland. The swamp reclaimed the rest. Today, only ruins remain, where the first sparks of self-government in America flickered beside the muddy James River. St. Stephen's, Alabama. Once a lively river port and the territorial capital, St. Stephen's was the first sign Alabama had of government in motion. Steamboats, merchants, and lawmakers filled its muddy streets. Then the river shifted, trade dried up, and new roads cut it out of the map. By the 1830s, the capital of tomorrow was an empty shell, its old brick courthouse sinking back into the earth. Kaskaskia, Illinois. Kaskaskia sat on the Mississippi's edge, first as a French village, then a capital of New Illinois. It had charm, promise, and river trade aplenty. But the river betrayed it, changing course, eating the banks, and finally isolating the town on an island. By the 1880s, floods had taken nearly everything. The first capital of Illinois now lies quiet, half gone to the water. Chillicothe, Ohio. A tidy river town lined with brick homes and ambition, Chillicothe served twice as Ohio's capital. Lawmakers liked its charm, but not its geography. It was too far south. When Columbus was built fresh and central, Chillicothe's brief glory faded. Still, the old Capitol site remains a symbol of first beginnings, where Ohio's statehood was inked by candlelight and sealed with frontier hope. Zanesville, Ohio. For 2 short years, Zanesville carried Ohio's capital dreams. They met in a courthouse perched above the Muskingum, planning roads and laws for a growing state. But the honor didn't last. When Columbus rose from the Center Plains, Zanesville went back to business, bridges, pottery, and mills. Locals still talk of the years when their town led the state, if only briefly. St. Charles, Missouri. In 1821, St. Charles became Missouri's stand-in capital, a river settlement where steamboats and speeches mingled on the breeze. The legislature met in borrowed rooms while Jefferson City was carved from wilderness. For 5 years, lawmakers hammered out a young state's laws. When they moved west, St. Charles went back to trading and river life, its capital days fading into polished brick and memory. Burlington, Iowa Territory. When the Iowa Territory was young, Burlington was its brain and beating heart. Perched high over the Mississippi, it hosted the first legislature, inked the laws, and watched the frontier roll west. But the capital moved inland to Iowa City in 1841, seeking higher ground and a central reach. Burlington stayed a proud river town, still echoing with the ambition that once guided a territory. Iowa City, Iowa. When Iowa outgrew Burlington, a gleaming capital rose on a bluff above the river, a city built to be the heart of a new state. For a while it was. Then progress marched west again, and Des Moines took the honor. Iowa City remained a place of thinkers and students. Its old capital turned into a museum of ideas once meant to rule the prairie. Belmont, Wisconsin Territory. The first seat of the Wisconsin Territory stood on a windy patch of prairie, built in haste from pine and hope. Legislators huddled through a freezing winter, wrote their first laws, and promptly decided to leave. By spring, the capital was packed up and gone. Belmont never forgot, though. All that remains are the foundations and a few stories about the coldest session ever held. Burlington, Wisconsin Territory. For a short spell, Burlington carried the title of capital, back when the borders between Wisconsin and what would become Iowa were still shifting. Lawmakers met in makeshift halls while the frontier redrew itself under their feet. When new lines were drawn, Burlington ended up in Iowa, not Wisconsin. Its capital dreams ended there, a brief confusion frozen in the pages of territorial history. Detroit, Michigan. Detroit's wide avenues and river docks made it a natural capital when Michigan was still wilderness. It became the center of trade, politics, and frontier ambition. But its border location worried lawmakers. Too exposed, too distant from new settlements. In 1847, Lansing took its place. Detroit went on to reinvent itself, first as a port, then a factory city, but its capital days faded quietly behind it. Savannah, Georgia. Savannah began as a colonial dream. Wide squares shaded by live oaks, cobblestone streets, and the hum of ships on the river. It was the capital of a colony and then of a young state. But as settlers pushed inland, so did politics. The seat wandered away, leaving Savannah with its beauty, its ghosts, and its stories of when Georgia's laws were written by the sea. Augusta, Georgia. In the Revolutionary years, Augusta became the safe capital when the coast felt dangerous. Lawmakers met in fine Georgian halls, trying to hold together a new state. But as Georgia's population moved west, so did its government, first to Louisville, then Milledgeville, and finally Atlanta. Augusta kept its grace and gardens, but its political glory became another chapter in Georgia's restless search for a home. Louisville, Georgia. For a few bright years, Louisville stood at the crossroads of the South, Georgia's new capital, built with optimism and a grand brick statehouse. But disease, fires, and the state's steady march inland dimmed its future. When the capital left in 1807, the town shrank back to quiet farming streets. Only the old marker remains to remind travelers that Georgia once ruled from here. Williamsburg, Virginia. After Jamestown burned, the capital moved to higher ground at Williamsburg, a neat little city of taverns, brick homes, and bright debate. It thrived for nearly a century, the hub of Virginia's colonial life, until 1780, when Richmond took over for wartime safety. Williamsburg faded to a quiet college town, until later generations restored it as the living museum of early America it is today. St. Mary's City, Maryland. Founded by English settlers in 1634, St. Mary's was Maryland's first capital and a haven for religious freedom. It prospered until rival ports and politics drew power north to Annapolis. By the early 1700s, the old capital was deserted, its brick foundations buried in farmland. Centuries later, archaeologists uncovered it again, piece by piece, like rediscovering the very roots of Maryland itself. New Castle, Delaware. Perched along the Delaware River, New Castle bustled with ships and trade when it served as the colony's capital. But the Revolution brought danger too close to the coast. In 1777, leaders moved inland to Dover for safety and stayed there. New Castle carried on quietly, its cobbled streets frozen in time, a place where history settled like the tide along its harbor wall. Perth Amboy, New Jersey. Back when New Jersey was two provinces, east and west, Perth Amboy was the seat of the eastern half. Royal governors came and went, holding court in grand homes by the bay. After the colonies united, the idea of twin capitals felt outdated. When Trenton took the honor, Perth Amboy went back to being a quiet port town, still proud of the power it once held. Burlington, New Jersey. Before Trenton, government business was split between Burlington in the west and Perth Amboy in the east. A long commute for the 1700s. Legislators finally agreed on one capital, and Burlington's political life faded with the tide. The town kept its dignity, though, a picture-perfect riverfront filled with colonial homes that whisper stories of when half a state's decisions were made right there by the Delaware. Kingston, New York. In 1777, while the Revolution burned hot, New York's first Constitution was signed in Kingston's modest courthouse. Weeks later, the British marched up the Hudson and torched the town. The flames drove the lawmakers inland, and Kingston never got the title back. But it rebuilt, stone by stone, and to this day, folks there still say it was the cradle of New York liberty. Poughkeepsie, New York. For one summer in 1788, Poughkeepsie was the center of the young nation's biggest debate, whether New York would ratify the Constitution. The vote was close, but the A's carried the day. Once the shouting died down, the lawmakers packed up, and Poughkeepsie returned to being a riverside town. Its moment in the spotlight was brief, but it helped decide the fate of a country. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Few cities have worn as many crowns as Philadelphia. It was the birthplace of independence, home of the Continental Congress, and Pennsylvania's capital for a time. But politics drifted westward, first to Lancaster, then Harrisburg, as the state grew. Philadelphia stayed a powerhouse, just no longer the seat of government. Its cobblestone streets and old halls still feel like the very bones of America. York, Pennsylvania. For 9 frantic months in 1777, York was the nation's capital in exile. The British had taken Philadelphia, and the Continental Congress fled west, setting up shop in the county courthouse. Here they passed the Articles of Confederation, ate cold suppers, and prayed the revolution would hold. When the danger passed, Congress left, and York returned to its quiet, rolling farmland pace. Exeter, New Hampshire. During the Revolution, New Hampshire's new government gathered in Exeter, a handsome little town where merchants and ministers talked independence by candlelight. They built a constitution, raised militias, and sent delegates to the Continental Congress. When peace came, the capital eventually moved to Concord, closer to the state's heart. Exeter stayed lovely and learned, proud to have steered a state through its stormiest years. New Haven, Connecticut. For generations, Connecticut couldn't quite decide between Hartford and New Haven, so it used both. Lawmakers spent half the year in each city, shuttling bills and ledgers between them. By 1875, the double system wore out its welcome, and Hartford became sole capital. New Haven didn't mind much. It had Yale, industry, and character enough to thrive long after the politicians moved out. Windsor, Vermont. In 1777, as thunder rolled over the Green Mountains, delegates met in a humble tavern in Windsor and wrote Vermont's first constitution. For nearly 3 decades, it served as the capital, until Montpelier was chosen for its central location. Windsor returned to its slow pace, full of white steeples and wooden bridges, holding tight to the memory of being Vermont's birthplace of liberty. Portland, Maine. When Maine split from Massachusetts in 1820, Portland naturally took the lead. Busy port, fine architecture, and a confident spirit. But its coastal location made it vulnerable and distant for inland farmers. 12 years later, Augusta was chosen as the new capital. Portland didn't lose a step. It kept growing into a cultural and commercial gem, a city that traded politics for permanence. Pensacola, Florida. Back when Florida was still wild and divided, Pensacola held the reins as territorial capital for the West. Spanish forts overlooked turquoise waters, and the town buzzed with traders and soldiers. But the territory's split capitals proved too unwieldy. By 1824, Tallahassee, midway between Pensacola and St. Augustine, became the compromise. Pensacola stayed a proud port, but its political glory sailed away with the century. Natchez, Mississippi. High on the river bluffs, Natchez was once the most elegant capital in the South. Cotton wealth, grand mansions, and power to match. But when Mississippi became a state, inland settlers wanted a capital closer to their farms. Politics drifted north to Washington, then Jackson. Natchez kept its beauty, but lost its voice in government, trading the roar of debate for the hush of magnolia trees. Washington on the Brazos, Texas. Here, in a rough wooden hall by the Brazos River, Texas declared its independence in 1836. For a brief moment, this frontier hamlet was the capital of a newborn republic. But the war, the heat, and the distance soon drove officials elsewhere. Today, only a few foundations remain, but every Texan knows the name. It's where a nation was born out of open prairie and grit. Columbia, West Columbia, Texas. After independence, Texas needed a home for its government fast, and Columbia fit the bill, if only for a few months. The hall was small, the heat relentless, and the town too hard to reach. By the end of 1836, the capital shifted to Houston. Columbia slipped back into quiet country life, leaving behind the honor of being the republic's first seat of power. Arkansas Post, Arkansas. Perched along the Arkansas River, this trading post turned territorial capital, saw flags of France, Spain, and finally America. For a short time, it was the seat of a young territory, a cluster of cabins surrounded by swampland. When Little Rock rose upriver, the capital moved, and Arkansas Post faded into reeds and river mud. Only earthworks remained to tell the story. Washington, Arkansas. When Union troops captured Little Rock during the Civil War, the state government fled southwest to Washington. For 2 years, this quiet town became the Confederate capital of Arkansas, printing money, passing laws, and praying for better news from the front. When the war ended, it went back to farming and trade. Today, preserved buildings still stand where a desperate government once held court. Fillmore, Utah. Brigham Young dreamed of a capital in the heart of Utah Territory, so Fillmore was chosen, and a stately capital began rising. But the desert proved lonely, and legislators found the trip too long. By 1856, meetings had drifted back to Salt Lake City, and Fillmore's dream was done. The unfinished capital still stands, a proud monument to a plan the frontier simply outgrew. Virginia City, Montana. When Bannock's boom faded, Virginia City rose overnight, saloon lights, mining dust, and new government business. For a decade, it served as capital, shaping the laws of a rough territory. Then Helena took the title in 1875, leaving Virginia City to slow down and grow old. Today, its wooden boardwalks still creak with stories of lawmen, miners, and the brief years when it ruled Montana.